My name is Andy Fair. I'm with the Chicago Committee Against War and Racism, and this is a very somber day. It's a somber day not just for the 3,000 who were killed, who were murdered on 9/11, 2001. It's a somber day because apparently this country has learned very little since then. There's going to be plenty of memorials today for the 3,000 who were murdered on September 11th, but unfortunately, there will be very few memorials for those who were murdered in the name of 9/11 subsequently. And while the 3,000 deserve to be more memorialized, it would be arrogant of us to not remember those who were murdered not just afterwards, but beforehand and paved the way for 9/11. It would be forgetting, for example, the 115,414 Afghans who died in the U.S. phase of the Civil War in Afghanistan. It would be ignoring the hundreds of thousands of lives lost in Iraq, the U.S. drone bombings and other bombings that spread to Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and likely several other countries we don't even know about to this day. Those lives are also connected to the 3,000 lives lost on 9/11. But there's also the lives who were lost before 9/11. It became impossible in this country to question why a group of people decided to murder the 3,000 people on September 11th, 2001. The only explanations that were given were Islamophobic, were racist, that those people were just that way. Truly amnesia about the role of the United States in the region for the preceding half century. I'm talking about the coup d'etats, the installing of dictators, the torture prisons that were supported by the dictators that the United States funded arms to over and over again. There was no examination of that allowed in the wake of 9/11. So is it any wonder that we keep on repeating the instances that gave rise to 9/11? The tagline of today's event is American domination and violence against other peoples invite further violence. The United States bears a huge responsibility for the fact that the Taliban today is the most viable political and military force in the country of Afghanistan. The United States played a pivotal role in bringing the 1992 to 2002 Taliban government to power, armed as it was in the Great Game against the Russians. As the U.S. Secretary of State Zbigniew Brzezinski himself cynically commented, quote, "What is the most important to history of the world? The Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War?" To him, it was all about U.S.-Russian rivalry. Who gets control of the world? And if tens of thousands are murdered in the course of it, well, they're just collateral damage. U.S. occupation and U.S. in attendance atrocities became the biggest recruiters for terrorism. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and a host of other brutal U.S. prisons and torture centers were the biggest recruiters to the terrorist groups. The New York Times several years ago, quoting top U.S. diplomats, reported, quote, detainee debriefs and intelligence reporting indicate that the U.S. treatment of detainees at Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, and elsewhere is the single most important motivating factor for TFFs, terrorist foreign fighters, traveling to Iraq, end quote. And as General Stanley McChrystal remarked, quote, in my experience, we found that nearly every time jihadists claimed that Abu Ghraib is what first had jolted them to action. And now we've got ISIS, the group that beheaded people across much of Iraq and Syria, arguably the most brutal terrorist group. As historian Alfred McCoy noted, quote, the largest of American prisons, Camp Bucca in southern Iraq, became the training ground for the most radical of jihadists, the future leaders of the Islamic State, or ISIS. By the time that prison closed in 2009, some 100,000 detainees had passed through its barbed wire, including the main founders of the Islamic State, notably its head, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, detained there for 5 years, and the 9 members of his top command. Quote, we had so much time to sit and plan, a senior member of Islamic State recalled. Quote, it was a perfect environment. We all agreed to get together when we got out. End quote. History has shown that the decline of empires, whether you're talking about the French Empire in North Africa and Algeria, or whether you're talking about the British Empire in the Indian subcontinent or Africa, that each of these empires relentlessly torture the people it's trying to control. It's no accident. These widespread tortures were, of course, exposed by Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks, and other courageous whistleblowers. And, of course, they're the ones who are victimized and not the people who conducted the tortures. We'll be hearing from civil rights attorney Jim Fennerty about how the human rights atrocities abroad in the periphery of the empire leaked homewards, debilitating further what passes for democracy and human rights in the United States, as they did with the French in Algeria, the British in India and Africa, and the U.S. with the John Burge tortures of the U.S. torture and terror Phoenix program in Vietnam, coming home to brutalize and terrorize black people for decades at the hands of the Chicago Police Department. It's hard to get our heads around the immense trauma, the mental and physical illness that the United States response to 9/11 caused. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, sisters, brothers, soldiers on all sides, traumatized, scarred horribly, psychologically and physically on a scale that we can't imagine. For every U.S. soldier killed, I might add, though, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Afghans and people of other countries who suffered at least as much. And yet when we talk about 9/11 in this country, we only talk about American dead. And that is frankly racist. And I think we need to call it out for such. And frankly, all the 9/11 memorials going on today that only talk about the 3,000 and ignoring the hundreds of thousands of others who were murdered subsequently in its name, that is racist as well. But this is being ignored in this country. This racism, this American exceptionalism, this feeling that it was a noble cause to invade Afghanistan. As General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, quote, your service mattered and was not in vain. That is a lie. It was totally in vain. The soldiers were horribly misused, as they were misused in Vietnam, as were, of course, their victims abroad. The people assembled here today, we were right in opposing the then impending invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, the drone bombings, the attacks on civil liberties. Those of us who are old enough, we were a tiny minority back in 2001, but we were right. And I think we also have to say, though, unfortunately, the post-9/11 U.S. response played a huge role in creating the mass dysfunction we see in U.S. society today. The mass mental illness of open bigotry, scapegoating, belief in conspiracy theories about the pandemic that end up killing people. The first step, though, to solving these problems is acknowledging that. And I'm hoping that this event today will do that. And so I'm just going to end reiterating our 5 demands. And I'll be saying a little bit more about them in closing about how we can go forward at the end of today's program. End all of the endless wars. We're talking about Yemen. We're talking about the drone bombings. End support for dictators. We're talking about Egypt and any number of other countries, Saudi Arabia. End sanctions on other nations. They're preventing important pandemic-related supplies going to a host of countries, whether you're talking about Cuba, whether you're talking about Iran, and any number of other countries, Venezuela. Respect self-determination abroad. People in this country got pissed off about the alleged Russian interference in the last couple of elections. But they say nothing about the coup d'etats that the United States has launched over and over and over again over the last half century. And finally, stand with oppressed communities at home. The racism abroad has seeped deep into the culture of the United States here. Not that that racism was invented on 9/11 by any stretch of the imagination, but it's one who's old enough to remember. We have a country right now where it's not a problem, apparently, to be an outright misogynist, an outright racist, an outright homophobe, outright bigot of any number of kinds. And that history has a lot to do with 9/11. So, you've heard from me enough. I want to bring up an important reminder about the horrible amnesia of the United States on this date, and that is a gentleman who can speak about the other 9/11. I'm talking about September 11th, 1973, when the United States supported a bloody coup in Chile, which murdered at least 3,000 people, certainly tortured tens of thousands more. Mario Venegas is a survivor of that torture. And so, Mario, if I could ask you to come up to the microphone, please, now.
Well, thank you, all of you, for being here this already afternoon in this commemoration of what September 11 here in the United States. But at the same time, and the thing that I wanted to bring up to you is there is another September 11 many years ago. Today here we are commemorating 20 years of the situation here in the United States with what happened there in DC with the Pentagon, what happened there in New York with the Twin Towers. It's amazing. I mean, to me, because as I said, we have 2 September 11. The other one, of course, is from my country, Chile. So I'm a survivor of a coup there in Chile, September 11, 1973, as Andy said, and at the same time a survivor, I would say, here in the United States of what happened on September 11, 2001. And I'm going to go, because that's what I've been asked to talk a little bit about what happened in Chile that day, because many people don't even know, even the generations now have not been educated on what happened there in that country. So my role today will be to little bit bring memories, and at least educate a little bit people to what happened. How was the military coup there prepared? What happened during the dictatorship and what happened after the dictatorship? That's what I'm trying to summarize a little bit here talking to you. As I said, I mean, I was here when the Twin Towers and Pentagon were crashed by airplanes. I was just watching from TV here, and it's amazing how my memory ran back when I saw the Pentagon in fire. I had been crashed by an airplane, and what happened in Chile on the same September 11, many years before, that there were the presidential palace was bombed, by aircraft, from the armed forces there, from the Air Force, and people being trained here in the United States as pilots of the Air Force. At the same time, they were contacting directly to the United States at that time on what was happening in Chile on the day of the coup, because Henry Kissinger and also President Nixon were programmers of this, were planning the thing just before September 11. What they did there was, try to ruin the country with the economy. They boycott the same thing that they have today in number of countries around the world, while they have this oil boycott. The punishment that they receive because they are changed different to the United States, like Venezuela, like Cuba. At that time, I'm talking about 48 years before, we were happening also that. The boycott, the economy was going collapsing because of the United States imposing. We didn't have any possibility to have any loan from banks, international bank, not even from other countries. It was amazing. So the country started being very difficult at that time. So that was the time when they planned it and they executed this military coup. And obviously, the planes bombing the presidential palace, as I said before, were U.S. American planes. Right here, and the Hawker Hunters, as you probably call them. And at the same time, there was the people were trained. The pilots were trained. Even more, there are people that are saying that driving the pilots were also American pilots, American Air Force there. Anyway, so that day for me so important. How was I shocked? I'm still suffering the trauma of having seen the Pentagon on fire. Said the same thing in the presidential palace in Chile. Well, that very day was when our president Salvador Allende was killed there after bombing, and the people, the army and the Air Force, were in the presidential palace, where was Salvador Allende defending the regime at that time. He was armed, so we always kind of say there was a armed rebellion about the people that were planning the coup. What happened then finally that he died there, and so today is 48 years exactly that we are commemorating the death of our president Salvador Allende, who was democratically elected. The only thing, for the United States, he was punished because he was a socialist. He was trying to bring democratic socialism as a regime into the country in Chile, and obviously that was not being accepted by the U.S. government. So that's why they start right away trying to prepare the coup and execute the coup. So finally, after that time, that was Allende. When he was Allende before, I would like to say that Allende's government was really a kind of reforms that he was doing for the people, like in education, economic, politically, military, a kind of reforms that he was doing in favor of the people, exactly. And that especially with the economic reforms, is one that affected mainly the government here in the United States, as well as all the multinationals around the world. So they all contribute to this coup with money, with military things, etc. And then Allende was president, but at the same time was the head of the Popular Unity, the Unidad Popular in Spanish, the coalition, the political coalition that we have at that time. And obviously there were all parties, from the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the left party, etc. And even Social Democratic Party was part at that time also. What was there? Instead, later on, Democratic Party came against Allende and also participated in the coup. Anyway, but the political coalition was so strong. Was supported by vast majority. Even just before Allende was the coup, we have like 45% of the population voting for the government, and the senators and etc. people in Congress. Well, the political situation changed drastically. Obviously, the economic situation when the dictatorship headed by Augusto Pinochet, the infamous Augusto Pinochet, that we all probably know about him. he was really an assassin, he was a corrupter, etc. So finally, he was taken out there when the people organized and tried to have a plebiscite, which imposed that he couldn't continue in the government. He was expelled there after a plebiscite, but again, during that time, obviously, General Pinochet claimed to be in the Senate, was member of the Senate. He continued being the general of the armed forces of the army. So that kind of thing was very difficult for the government to try to solve after that. So, and then again, I mean, just to inform a little bit about, by the time of the coup, we have more than 1,000 military people being trained in the School of the Americas, which was in Panama. So they were all prepared when the coup happened to torture, to kill, to interrogate people, etc. I was one of them. I was in detention, in concentration camp for more than 2.5 years. And I was tortured there, and unbelievable. But those torturers, I could identify them later, were all trained in the School of the Americas when they were in Panama. And unfortunately, still the army and today the police, Carabineros in Chile, are sending people to be trained, in the School of the Americas, who is now here in Georgia, in Fort Benning. And it's unbelievable because they have learned techniques these days, the same that are using, because people have been trained also from Colombia, from Peru, from everywhere. They have been sending people to be trained, army officer, now the police officers. For instance, what happened in Chile, which was terrible during that time, that the people were being killed later on. I mean, because after that, well, the people could manage to get over, but we couldn't change the policy or the program of neoliberalism, which is the one that really ended killing the economy, because neoliberalism was not just an economic program. It was economic, politically, socially, even military. So that executed that during the government of Pinochet, during the dictatorship, and they were supporting, from here, from University of Chicago, the economic school, with Milton Friedman, were the one that implanted there, forced Chile to implant there what we call now the neoliberalism. And this thing is still there. We haven't been able, after 30 years or whatever, after the dictatorship for 40 years, to change that, because they left everything in legal aspect, which is the Constitution, which is something that we are trying to change now. Today, the people obtain a possibility to have a plebiscite that they change the Constitution, and we are doing that. We are writing up the Constitution, which has to get rid of the Constitution that we inherited from Pinochet in 1985. So, for those years, still you have that Constitution that favors, evidently, the Constitution, what is the neoliberalism applied there in Chile. So all the things are happening now, which also October 18 of 2017, again, the people wake up.
2019.
October 19, yeah.
18, 2019.
October 18, in 2017, right?
19.
Or 19. Okay, I'm sorry, 19. But that's more than that, almost 2 years ago. And then the people wake up about that, because they found that still the government, now with a very right-wing government, Piñera is a new government in Chile for 2 years now, and he implanted there exactly what it was learned during the neoliberalism time and imposed again. They have all free, they don't have free education, they don't have anyone in the pension program, it's all privatized, everything is there. So the people woke up and start protesting about, that date. So after 30 years, and they start with the slogan that, because 30 pesos in Chilean pesos was the increase of the public transportation at that day. And the students mainly, the young people mainly start protesting, etc. So they call it's not just 30 pesos, it's 30 years while we're here protesting, while we're here to change all the situation, the economic, politically, military, social situation that they have been going through all these years. So now we are having that, and we are having the people very active today. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic situation, they have to stop all the protests that we're having because, well, every country will have to say the same. I mean, the government, very dictatorial government, have a great thing with the pandemic because they have to suspend every kind of activity public. So that's thing. But again, the people now are again back in the streets. Today, for instance, a lot of people in the street commemorating September 11 in Chile, and having protests again, and it's a new situation that we're going through now in Chile. But and I'm not going to give all the details about that, but the repression there, of course, because of these people protesting, etc., has been terrible. I mean, made me feel like we're back to the dictatorship, because the army has been in the street, we have state of siege, we have everything against, and we have people that have been severely, injured. Like people, for instance, even blinded, because people now, the technique that they have learned here in the School of the Americas, like the police, the carabineros, are shooting to your face, to your eyes. So we have more than 500 kids, mainly young kids, that are already blinded or have been injured on their eyes. And that's terrible. I mean, we have a lot of political prisoners again, like, about 1,500 that we have in different concentration or even jails that we have in Chile at this time. So we are fighting to get all that, to get, they have impunity, all these violations of human rights. So we are trying again against impunity, all the kind of things that we are doing now. But, I think that just to end, I would like to kind of make similarities of what here in the United States and in Chile. I mean, the number of similarities that I could find is that, for instance, techniques or surveillance are exactly the same that we have here and that we have now there in Chile. So the social media everywhere, they have cameras everywhere to detect people movements, etc., etc. The second thing that is very common here and there is about the repression that we have suffered and the repression that here in the United States we have suffered. I mean, they have learned all these techniques. Here, also, the police are shooting in their eyes to people that are protesting. And the other thing is like the techniques of interrogation and torture are exactly the same here and there. I mean, most of the things learned, especially even here in the School of the Americas, by the police department, also by the army here in the United States. Now, the other thing that we are sharing, in terms of similarity, because what happened in Guantanamo and is still happening, and what happened in Chile. I mean, there is where people were tortured the most, in this center in Guantanamo. I mean, we have also something in common, that is the secret department of detention everywhere around the world, which I don't like the word, but they call it black centers, black rooms, something like that. Because, it's reality. There is where they have been tortured, interrogated, even taken from other countries, that they put these secret centers in different countries now. And the other thing, which is the same thing as I said before, the total impunity that have the people that have violated human rights here and there in Chile. So these are the other big similarities which you are struggling against that thing, the more we can. The police brutality, which is clearly, here better than me probably how been the police brutality. So we have been having all these similarities there in Chile 48 years ago or 20 years ago, more than now what happened today. Also, the people of Chile, I think they were waking up after all this situation, and I think that is kind of similarity here too. When people in the United States woke up and start protesting and start because of racism, because of the police brutality, which was the maximum thing I've seen on the protests and everything was after they killed George Floyd. That's one of the right thing that people who can see in the street, they protest, etc. But at the same time, I have a similarity here, because I think that the consequences of all this has been neoliberalism imposed not just in South America or in America, even now here in the United States. They have been applied the neoliberalism program that is affecting the population, and that's why people are waking up and are protesting for this kind of things. Talking here as an activist for human rights, but at the same time representing the different organizations that work here in Chicago. está the Illinois School of the Americas Watch, which we have a lot of work so they can close that School of the Americas. We are also here representing Sierra Lane, Chicago Religious Leadership Network in Latin America, which we do a lot of work for human rights in Latin America, even more in immigration, especially with children that have been suffering here because, well, the border where they are detained, and etc. Also with ICAT, Illinois Coalitions Against Torture, here in Chicago. Also representing CTJC, Chicago Torture Justice Center, which was a center that was created after we have reparation from the city of Chicago that we have it. We fight for that. We fought for that. We obtained that reparation. One of the points in reparation is to create a center that we can help all these people that were tortured by the police here in Chicago, by the commander, Bush commander, who, well, we couldn't bring him to trial. He was detained for 5 years, something like that, because he was lying when he was being interviewed by the judicial system. The other people that I like to also mention here is, well, we have an organization which Solidarity Chile Chicago, that we are also very active supporting what happened in Chile and also what's happening here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario Venegas, a true human rights leader. Now, a lot of people probably thought when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan that perhaps we were going to have a bursting forth of human freedom in the land. Well, as President Obama before him signaled, unfortunately, Biden is doing a so-called pivot to East Asia. And for anyone who knows the history of the Philippines and the fact that some 200,000 people were murdered in the course of the United States suppressing the Philippine nation back in the late 19th, earliest 20th century, well then, the Filipino people really don't want, I think, a pivot to East Asia. And to tell us more about that and much more, I'm very happy to introduce Bev Tang of International League of People's Struggles Midwest, who is going to tell us perhaps more about that dreaded pivot to East Asia.
Good afternoon, Chicago. Woo. We want to welcome everybody around here to also gather around. Hopefully you get to listen more to what the speakers have to say, because we are trying to actually speak to you. Hopefully you can take away some of this information and share it with others, or even ask more questions and join the different organizations that are out here today. My name is Bev, again with the International League of People's Struggle. And I just want to start that with, when recalling the horrific events of 9/11, let us honor all those lives lost by remembering the history of the U.S. and understanding who the true enemy of the people really is. Only then can we actually take steps to heal and rectify the wrongs. Only if we recall the history of bloodshed carried out by the ruling class of this country will we remember that it is based on the enslavement of people from North America to Africa to Latin America to Asia Pacific. And to this day, it has not stopped its conquest for more capital, resources, labor, and ultimately more power. This is what we mean when we say the U.S. is an imperialist power. After the territorial division of the world amongst imperialist powers in World War II, the U.S. emerged as the dominant imperialist superpower. To suppress its own people who were speaking out against the poor living and working conditions here inside the U.S., the wars against the people took the form of the McCarthyist Psy-War campaign against revolutionaries, the FBI counterintelligence program against national liberation struggles and the civil rights movement, and the near destruction of working class organization through neoliberal reforms, and the co-opting of the labor movement's leadership. The U.S. intensification of coups d'etats and the bloody onslaught of imperialist aggression against the peoples of the world culminated in a ground-shattering retaliation on its own soil, the 9/11 attacks. Under Bush Jr., the U.S. ruling class responded, launching the so-called War on Terror, demonizing and scapegoating adherents of Islam to justify the death march of imperialism and to assign a new target for its endless wars of aggression. This was paired with mass surveillance and assault on civil rights within the U.S. itself in the form of the Patriot Act and continued with the prison project under Obama. Sowing confusion among the U.S. people's movements, the liberal parties, and organizations which serve to reinforce the current monopoly capitalist system espouse solutions which shun the right of working class and national liberation movements to wage just and militant struggles for self-determination and social liberation. A movement without clear analysis of who is the ruling class was encouraged, and that divided people along identity lines instead of marking really who is the common friends and enemies by class line, ultimately dividing the U.S. working class from the international working class. There is a need for a clear anti-imperialist analysis and strategy for building a broad and anti-imperialist united front to deal effective blows to imperialism. 2021, this year marks the International League of People's Struggle 20th year since its founding. The ILPS was built to unite the people in exposing and opposing imperialism as the true number one enemy of the people across the world, as it puts profit over the people and the entire planet. We stand here today with our comrades and with the people of the world to unmask the U.S. imperialists' continued intent under Biden to spread its global domination militarily, economically, politically, and socially, all at the expense of the working class and the environment. Let us not be fooled by the lies they feed us on this solemn anniversary. We must question our government. When you wonder where the government assistance is for the pandemic relief, whether it be unemployment, housing, and health care, you should also ask why, under Biden, is it spending billions to destabilize governments in Latin America, or giving $2.4 billion in war machines and weapons to the fascist dictator Duterte in the Philippines, who has already killed over 300,000 of his own people in his war on the poor, which is disguised as a drug war, and is silencing and killing off any dissent. Why is this government imposing sanctions which deny the people of basic commodities and medicine for their survival in countries like Cuba? Why will Biden not use his executive powers to stop Enbridge from building their Line 3 dirty tar sands oil pipeline on native soil, which threatens to devastate our waterways of the Mississippi River from Minnesota through our Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico? May all the lives lost as a result of the U.S. crimes against humanity and the environment not be in vain, because we must never forget that corporate greed and imperialist plunder is our true and common enemy. So we ask you to join us, join the organizations here and the movement to bring down this imperialist beast. We call for money for jobs and education, not for war and occupation. Money for jobs and education, not for war and occupation. Money for health care, not for war and occupation. The U.S. are really the number one terrorists. Thank you.
Thank you, Bev Tang, International League of People's Struggles, Midwest. Next, I'd like to invite up Marsha Bernstein, who is a leader of Chicago area peace action, which has been a stalwart force opposing the wars for many years now.
So as I woke up this morning and was doing the regular household type things, I was thinking about 9/11 and thinking about how the U.S. response to 9/11 basically made no sense. We knew very shortly after that the pilots who were piloting the planes were from Saudi Arabia. But did we attack Saudi Arabia? No, we didn't attack Saudi Arabia. We're good friends with the Saudis. We just gave them a whole bunch more military armaments. Totally makes no sense. Who did we go after? We went after poor countries that had geopolitical value to us. Afghanistan has been a road that the Soviets tried for a while to dominate with unsuccess. So, you know, it didn't work for them, but we're going to have a much better luck with this. Then we went into Iraq, and I remember us being on street corners saying, no war for oil. Our response to 9/11 and the thousands, if not millions of people across the planet who have died as a result of the 3,000 who tragically died as a result of the World Trade Center bombings. You know, it just doesn't make sense. So this morning, again, while at my computer, I happened to get a thing from Common Dreams. And Common Dreams this morning had a whole bunch of articles on 9/11. And so I'm just going to read a few of the headlines with the author and the little blurb that came after, because it speaks to all the myriad different ways we could be thinking about today. 9/11 at 20, our moral obligation after 2 decades of war, by Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II and Tope Valerian. First, Washington needs to stop killing people. Next, we have to challenge our nation's assumptions and priorities. Article 2, the innocent victims of America's war on terror deserve remembrance too, as Andy brought up earlier today. By Mitchell Zimmerman. Countless people died in the 20 years of war our country launched in the name of our 9/11 dead. Third, many Americans refused to consider why 11 happened. The costs were enormous, by Stephen Zunes. Middle East experts who opposed America's post-9/11 wars were ridiculed as anti-American extremists. In reality, it was the pro-war right that was making us less safe. What they referred to as their 9/11 archives, the algebra of infinite justice by Arundhati Roy. It will be a pity if, instead of using this as an opportunity to try to understand why September 11th happened, Americans use it as an opportunity to usurp the whole world's sorrow, to mourn and avenge only their own. By Brett Wilkins, 20 years after 9/11, the only way to effectively counter terror is to end war. Anti-war voices reflect on 2 decades of the misguided hubris, failed policies, war profiteering, suffering, and death that resulted from the 9/11 attacks. Kathy Kelly, Chicago's own. 20 years after 9/11, reparations for Afghanistan and an end to war. The only way to combat terrorism is to end these wars for vengeance and profit. Lastly, We still need a post-9/11 reckoning by Rana, and I'll butcher her name, Abdel Hamid. Because as much as American history is about triumphing over hardship, too often it's been about finding a minority of religion, of race, of sexuality, of immigration status to blame for that hardship. So any one of those articles would be a wealth of things to think about in terms of what does 9/11 mean. And it's a somber day and a day for us all to reflect on what it means to be a U.S. citizen and the harm that we have caused and continue to cause across the planet. Thank you.
Our next speaker, her organization, Black Alliance for Peace, has played a courageous role in exposing the United States and United Nations meddling in Haiti in particular, and bringing the anti-war voice to include Africa in the diaspora. Vashina is Austin of Black Alliance for Peace. Her organization has been a courageous voice speaking out why everyone in this nation needs to pay attention to things like AFRICOM in Africa, that most people, including those in the United States anti-war movement, know so little about. The drone bombings that continue to attack the peoples of Africa, the United States meddling in dictating who rules Haiti. Black Alliance for Peace has been a leader in all of that. So without any further ado, Vashina Austin, please come up and share your thoughts.
Greetings, everybody. I'm really glad that the Black Alliance for Peace could be a part of this event. I think it's super important that we're all out here. Just a little bit of background about our alliance. We are a network of radical organizations and individuals who are dedicated to rebuilding the anti-war positions of the Black radical tradition. We fight to end the war on African people in the U.S. and abroad. Every time I speak on behalf of BAP, I have to make it clear that when I say peace, I mean peace by any means necessary. Now more than ever, we must commit ourselves to this radical idea of peace, because seeing peace as an absence of conflict will not suffice in an empire that has historically maintained a commitment to capitalist exploitation and white supremacist global domination. This empire does not understand an absence of conflict. The United States' response to the tragedy of 9/11 was and has been one of extreme opportunism and a continuation of the racist colonial violence that was used upon the theft of this land. On this day, 20 years ago, we lost about 3,000 lives, and the U.S. turned that number into hundreds of thousands through the occupation of a country that had no involvement in the attack. During this time, they have used the tragedy to manipulate the public into supporting their quest to expand U.S. hegemony throughout the global South. They have used this tragedy to normalize religious, racial, and political repression through sanctions, coups, assassinations, occupation, and countless other violations of the people's fundamental human rights domestically and globally. Since 9/11, we've seen a significant increase in police militarization, with terror as their justification, but this only served to increase terror on Black and brown communities. They absurdly claim that the police agencies need military weapons from the 1033 program to fight the war on drugs, but we know that this is yet another tactic to suppress the African working class. From the Home and Square Black site to the torture centers throughout the Middle East to Chile, we must see and make clear the connections between how the military violates colonized people abroad and how the police violates colonized people here on this land. With the help of the mainstream media, this nation has manufactured mass ignorance regarding the response to 9/11 and all other intentions of the terrorist group that we call the U.S. military. From the bombing of Somalia to the invasion of Afghanistan, continuous support given to settler colonial Israel, to having military-to-military operations in 53 out of the 54 countries in Africa through AFRICOM, This country has been relentless in masquerading as the embodiment of human rights with the bullshit justification of humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect, which are no different from the arrogant, racist idea of the white man's burden. All while stealing land, labor, and resources from colonized people abroad. We are not confused. We know that this psychopathic empire needs to be first in everything, and that includes violating human rights. It is for these reasons that as people living in the imperial core, we have an obligation to reject every expression of white supremacist colonial capitalist patriarchy. Living in the belly of the beast, we must stand on the side of the oppressed internally and internationally. It is our duty to fight for the people because a continuation of Western domination means perpetual suffering for humanity. It is our duty to fight for and embrace a people-centered human rights because it is only then that the oppressed can begin to walk on the path to true liberation. Peace by any means necessary, no compromise, no retreat. Thank you.
Thank you, Vashina. For our last speaker before we wrap up, we've been purposely talking about the rest of the world for the most part here because 9/11 shouldn't just be about the United States or even mainly about the United States. It's what the United States did to so much of the rest of the world following 9/11. The countless many more thousands murdered and injured post 9/11. But we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the attack on civil rights and civil liberties that happened, that were brought out and used an excuse to roll out here in this country. And I can think of no better person to talk about this than Jim Fennerty, past president of the Chicago chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. And just a little bit about Jim, because you should know. Following the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, some 10,000 of us marched peacefully on Lakeshore Drive in protest of that. Later that night, Mayor Richard M. Daley, to get revenge on that act that showed that he didn't control his own city, he corralled some 900 of us and arrested us. And it was a long, drawn-out civil rights battle that followed. And Jim and the National Lawyers Guild here in Chicago took the leadership. Frankly, Jim helped revive a somewhat moribund NLG chapter to become a true fighting organization in the city the way it had been previously, and ultimately won an $11 million settlement out of the city because the United States, I should say Richard M. Daley, had conducted the single largest mass arrest in Chicago history on the night of March 20th, 2003. It was also the single largest mass false arrest in the city's history. And we were only able to demonstrate that thanks to the effort of Jim and his colleagues in the National Lawyers Guild. And they have been doing far more. They've been helping oppressed communities, particularly Arabs and Muslims, who felt the wrath of the United States following 9/11. So without further ado, Jim Fennerty will be our final speaker, if he doesn't get run over by a Segway.
Thank you, Andy. I'll give you your money later for all those praises you put on me. I'm here mainly to talk about the U.S. Patriot Act. The act was signed into law by George W. Bush shortly after 9/11, which was October 26, 2001. It was not really a new idea. It was on the conservative wish list of the legislation that was passed at this time. And it was an attack on the gains of social movements of the 1960s and the 1970s. The U.S. Patriot Act basically attacked the constitutional principles of freedom of association, the right to a fair trial, and the right to privacy, and bans on illegal searches and seizures. It allowed the president to unilaterally declare organizations and individuals to be terrorists, and those having any association with them, such as them talking to a journalist, to being to aiding and abetting terrorism, subject to penalties for doing that. It allowed the use of secret evidence against defendants. And one of the things that happened right shortly after, well, a couple of years after the Patriot Act was signed, was all of a sudden then they said that all Muslims who were not citizens had to register with the U.S. government. And after they registered, eventually, they said they all had to report in to be questioned about their politics and what they were doing. And what happened was that, so basically one of the things the Lawyers Guild did in that situation is that we got attorneys, volunteer attorneys, to represent these people at these interrogations. But basically nobody was ever arrested from that situation. But it was part of the process of intimidation. And also at this time too, they were also attacking, the government was also attacking basically charities. They were attacking the charities mostly of Muslim organizations, and especially those Palestinians, trying to shut them down. But also too, basically also the Patriot Act also allowed for the loosened already protections against government surveillance, allowing government to, without probable cause, to even track down the library books people were reading. The U.S. Patriot Act established ICE, also known as the Immigration Control and Enforcement and Department of Homeland Security, which heightened repression in immigrant communities. President Bush used the Patriot Act to shut down, like I said before, many other organizations from Muslims in the community. But I want to go over five things that what happened in the Patriot Act itself. The act reduced the checks and balance on government oversight by giving law enforcement officials permission to collect intelligence on legal citizens in the United States. It reduced accountability by no more public oversight. It made it harder for individuals to challenge a search warrant. It allowed the government to target citizens not under criminal investigations. It allowed an unlawful imprisonment of citizens. And one thing happened in 2010, this whole part of after the passing of the Patriot Act, we had raids in Chicago here. We had raids on people's homes and with search warrants. And the FBI went to homes in Chicago, several homes in Chicago, and in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And basically they seized even their kids' school books and used that, hoping to find something against these people. Eventually, nobody was indicted. Nobody went to jail, and it was just dropped. But we don't know exactly what the reasons were that they dropped these charges. Probably because these people did nothing illegal. But anyways, and also too it's that we have to keep fighting. We can't stop. And I want to say one comment too here that somebody mentioned about talking about overthrowing other governments. I just want to throw this out there. No other government in the entire world has ever been involved in so many coups or coup attempts than the United States of America.
That's right.
And that's not going to stop right now. They're going to keep doing that. Also, too, I want to say one thing. I was looking up something about Fidel Castro one day and attempts on his life. It listed basically hundreds of times the U.S. government had tried to overthrow the government of Cuba and get Fidel Castro out of Cuba. So anyways, I want to thank Andy for having me speak today, and keep up the good work, and hopefully next time we can get some more younger people instead of old people like me. I'm 103 years old. So anyways, all right, take care.
Just a few closing comments here, if you'll bear with me, please. I mentioned at one point that we in this country were a tiny minority opposing the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Fortunately, many, many more joined us in opposing the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But the question then is, why aren't we having a Kathy Kelly or a Noam Chomsky or a Mario Venegas being interviewed when all the professional commentators have been shown to be wrong over and over and over again? I think when you think about the character of the United States government, the question begins to answer itself. People talk about bringing this country to have a just foreign policy, a humanitarian approach to other nations. And these are the excuses given for U.S. invasion after invasion after invasion. But is the main purpose of the U.S. state liberation? Look at the huge prison industrial complex, the 40% of the world's arms that are produced and bought for by the United States government, the 800 plus military bases littered across the globe, the huge police forces bearing down on especially black and brown communities here in the United States. Can these instruments of violence be simply turned into instruments of good? If we got Kathy Kelly as Secretary of State, would the American state suddenly become peaceful and supporting goodwill? I think it's naive to think so. I think it's naive to think that change can ever come from the top, from either political party. This government, which has invaded and which has launched coups against other nations for far lesser slights, will not allow itself to be turned over by a mere vote of the people, by the correct amount of ballots being tossed into a box. And in the unlikely event that we succeeded, despite all the hurdles of money and institutions, we would probably end up with what we had in Chile, a bloody coup. So what that says to us today is we talk about what we can do to get food to the Afghani people, to get medicines to all the countries that are denied them in the midst of this pandemic, including Afghanistan. It says we cannot look to our leaders to provide those sorts of solutions. Unfortunately, it falls on us and others like us in this country and around the world. That is the way that human liberation has always been won. It's always been from the bottom up and not the top down. So I thank every one of you and your organizations for being out here today, because this truly is the path forward from the 9/11 and the bombings and the invasions and the tortures that came afterwards. Liberation comes from people themselves and not the governments of the world. Thank you very much for coming out today.